What other problems have we found? This is an insurance problem. It has been, and I suspect remains, acute. There were some legislative changes that were supposed to help solve this problem, but at least our interviews with journalists showed that very often these are changes on paper. That is, in reality, they do not have the kind of insurance that could cover the risks associated with working in a combat zone. If we talk about freelancers, this was also a separate component that we looked at. The situation is even more difficult for them. They are less secure. What is interesting is that even when it comes to freelancers working for large international media or large international news agencies, despite the fact they partially receive some benefits from their cooperation, very often these are limited benefits, and mostly, as they say themselves in the interview, to a large extent everything depends on them personally. The employers display the same attitude. That is, if you're a freelancer, you take your own risks. In continuation of the topic of journalist vulnerability, we cannot fail to mention the vulnerability associated with employment practices in Ukraine. The reality that it is very often employment through the registration as a private entrepreneur or some short-term contracts without being enrolled in the staff. And accordingly, then labor laws do not apply to journalists, which also makes them vulnerable. We have considered this component because, again, it is part of the general global methodology of UNESCO, because it is also about the level of journalist protection. And of course, in Ukraine, unfortunately, it is difficult to understand the scale of how journalists are employed, according to which model, because these are often such mixed forms, changing forms. Therefore, unfortunately, there is a lack of data here. There have been, and I suspect remain, particular difficulties for the media and journalists in the occupation. Unfortunately, there is little data for obvious reasons. That is, it is dangerous, it is vulnerable, it is a very sensitive topic. And if we talk about some recent events, it also applies to cases of capture of Ukrainian journalists. That is, there is this period of uncertainty where both relatives and colleagues are not sure how they should act, whether they should give publicity or act through some of their own channels. But of course, the data that is available and the evidence that is available illustrate that it is very difficult, very threatening, very dangerous for journalists who find themselves in the occupation, and they face very great risks. And often not only risks, but also immediate danger.